Welcome back to the final most accurate podcast preview show here at 4for4 Football. I am your host, John Daigle, here to close out the Fantasy Championship week with none other than the man working around the clock through the holidays, trying to get the projections and rankings updated for week 17, none other than friend in life, John Paulson. Paulson, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right. I had a little bit of an internet issue there, so I appreciate everybody that's waiting to hear us talk about every single matchup for week 17. And also, this is your last live stream with me. So I just want to say thanks, John, for being a great partner in crime. And it's been nice to get to know you and work with you. You're a professional, and sad to see you go.
That is for the people listening on audio. Yes, I wasn't going to mention it because I'm the kind of person, like Devontae Adams says, run your routes, don't get on Instagram, and just show up to work. And yes, this will be the final stream between us as I pass onto the great beyond, even though I think that's an analogy for death, not anything else. It'll be okay. Until then, we have to get everyone ready for their fantasy championship, and that begins tonight with the Jets and the Browns, has leaked all the way down to a 34-point total. And it's been interesting to see how people view Joe Flacco following his amazing performance along with Amari Cooper. Obviously, everyone knows by now, 250 yards, a couple touchdowns this past week against a soft Texans defense. The issue is that the Jets defense is not the same at all. Whereas Flacco had success against the Jaguars, Rams, Texans. This spot is very similar to the Bears matchup that he finished as the QB 15 with a handful of interceptions against. Only Josh Allen, one time this year, has gone for over 20 fantasy points against this New York secondary. So I am concerned about this spot, especially for people who are thinking that he's a top 12 quarterback. What are your thoughts in ranking Flacco this week?
I would agree with all that. He is a volume-based streamer. But the matchup, as you mentioned, is terrible. The Jets are first in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. His primary receiver, Amari Cooper, is banged up. We're not even sure that he's going to play or be 100% tonight. So yeah, he's a quarterback here in the middle of these QB2 rankings that's likely to attempt 40+ passes. If he's even decent on a yards per attempt, he's got a good chance at pushing for 250. Maybe he throws a touchdown or two, but this is not a ceiling play with Joe Flacco this week. He's just sort of he's in that group with, below Derek Carr, Jake Browning, Gardner Minshew. That's kind of the tier that I have him in this week. And it's basically because he has been so pass heavy and the Browns have been so pass heavy. The way to beat the Jets is to run the ball, but I don't know if the Browns are going to commit to that.
Because they have found their identity, as you mentioned, with Joe Flacco averaging 43 pass attempts. But again, no one gets there, so I doubt Flacco will as well. We saw Elijah Moore, when Flacco first went under center, have a 29% target share when Amari Cooper left the field. Cooper's still questionable at the time of this recording. So let's assume Cooper plays. How are you handling his status in this game?
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to be too much better for him, even though, obviously there's going to be a target uptick. Maybe he's getting more attention from this very stingy Jets secondary. So I don't know that he would go up the rankings too much. Wouldn't have a ton of faith in him. But he's at 47 right now, so he's a low-end wide receiver 4. He probably would be in the ranked in the low 30s as the primary pass catcher. But I think maybe that's David Njoku's job if Amari Cooper's out.
And for the Jets side of the ball, anyone else to consider outside of Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson from Trevor Siemian in this spot?
I don't think so. I mean, I think if you're in a really deep league, maybe Tyler Conklin, but it's really Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson, and you really can't trust those two as much as other matchups because the Browns are pretty stingy. But I do think that Breece Hall is a low end RB1. Given all the targets that he's seeing, he's been really involved as a pass catcher. And even if the running game isn't going great, they could still pepper him with targets. And I kind of feel the same way about Garrett Wilson. I've got him ranked as a wide receiver 3 just because this, Trevor Siemian situation isn't even as good as Zach Wilson. So he's more of a volume-based wide receiver 3, and maybe he gets there just based on getting 12 to 15 targets or something like that. But I don't see him being highly efficient.
Extremely excited for Saturday night secluded on its own in prime time between the Lions at the Cowboys, an indoor matchup that favors everyone in the passing game. I think the question mark everyone has in your rankings is, how are you viewing Tony Pollard? Because this Lions front seven has continued suffocating everyone. No running back yet has reached 70 rushing yards against them. And since they returned from their bye from week 10 on, they're allowing just 3.1 yards per carry and less than 17 PPR points per game. The thing is, as I was prepared to bench Tony Pollard quite easily everywhere, Rico Dowdle has now been ruled out, putting Pollard in a situation I would say similar to a Clyde Edwards-Helaire, with both players have not been good all year, but it seems like he's going to handle every single touch in this game. So how are you viewing an every touch Pollard in a tough spot?
Yeah, if Dowdle's out, and I haven't had a chance to adjust the rankings for that, so I'll just tell you that prior to that, Pollard was at 23, which is quite low for him. He's usually in the, lately, even he hasn't had the greatest year, but he's been in the RB10 to RB15 range.
Mm-hmm.
But this week was particularly bad with Detroit, splitting time with Dowdle. But with Dowdle out, I'm sure he will move up and he'll get into those mid-teens probably, where Ezekiel Elliott, Raheem Mostert, Austin Eckler are, as more of a lower efficiency, bad matchup, but high touch player, because he is likely to see the vast majority of touches with Dowdle out.
I also believe on the other side of the ball, because again, everyone knows they're playing both quarterbacks, the receivers in the passing game across the board as well. Even Brandon Cooks, who's become a touchdown or bust option, this is the spot to go right back to him. But for the Lions running backs, although Jahmyr Gibbs has gotten there, David Montgomery has now out-touched him in back-to-back games. And I think people have just been somewhat upset about Montgomery's results, even though he did sneak in for a goal line score last week. How are you handling these two running backs in this spot?
Yeah, so last 2 weeks, as you mentioned, 38 touches for Montgomery, 32 touches for Gibbs. However, the touchdowns are 4-1 in Gibbs's favor. Yards are 208 to 151 in Gibbs's favor. So, you're looking at 75 yards on average for Montgomery over the last 2 weeks on 19 touches per game. He really needs to take one of these or two of these touchdowns away from Gibbs to be, ranked to where he had been previously ranked, which was, in that 15 to 20 range, 15 to 25 range. Right now, I have him a bit lower because it does seem like this backfield is shifting, at least from an efficiency standpoint, goal line standpoint, to where Gibbs is getting those goal line opportunities, those scoring opportunities.
Raiders at the Colts. And let's start on the Raiders side of the ball. We are still waiting on Josh Jacobs, who may miss his third consecutive game. And honestly, if it's yet again Zamir White under center, it's an incredible spot to once again start him, because the Colts have just been dusted by running backs. 29 PPR points per game collectively to backfields out of their bye. Even Rashad Henry and Derek White, who usually don't go over 100 yards, reached that mark against them. Last week, Tyler Algier and Bijan Robinson averaged over 6 yards per carry too. So if Jacobs is out, I would imagine we both don't have any amount of fear going right back to Zamir.
Yeah, he's one of those, backups that I probably have the most confidence in this particular week, given the matchup against the Colts, who are 31st adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. I think, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, maybe you had more faith in him, but I wasn't entirely sure that Zamir White was capable for taking over Josh Jacobs' role and being that effective of a runner. But he's averaging 5.49 yards per carry over the last 2 weeks, and it's 214 yards on 39 carries. The Raiders have made no bones about it. They want to establish the run, and Zamir White is the central figure in that. It does not seem like I thought Josh Jacobs might be back this week, because it seemed like he might have been semi-close last week, and maybe they just decided to give him another week, but he hasn't practiced as of today. So I put Zamir White back in the rankings, and he comes in at RB17, right ahead of Edwards-Helaire, who you mentioned at RB18.
And yes, that was the most frustrating thing, honestly. It wasn't trying to navigate our matchups and all the information going from day to day for week 16. It was that we were just following the tea leaves. And I assumed on Saturday, it seemed like Josh Jacobs was going to play. And so I left Zamir White everywhere. And then, of course, Christmas morning, because the NFL just wanted to continue their capitalism approach. I instead was left shuffling for anyone to pick up, and that led me to start Justin Watson instead, just to have someone go since Josh Jacobs was no longer there. But for this one, also, we saw Devontae Adams. I shouldn't say Adams. We saw Aiden O'Connell struggle with literally 0 passing yards over the last 3 quarters against the Chiefs. The Chiefs do shut down opposing wide receiver ones, 31st in points per game. So although Adams struggled immensely, you could still paint the picture and say that's why he failed to get there. In this matchup, though, how do you see him faring?
The Colts defense isn't anything special. I would say, middle of the road against the passing game. They're 9th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers. They are 10th against quarterbacks. So they are a bit worse, significantly worse against the run than they are against the pass. But, you wouldn't think that. I mean, O'Connell, the game before the Chiefs game, had just this crazy stat line of 4 touchdowns against the Chargers. So you would think this would be a bounce back situation. The Colts seem to be in these, high scoring games, week after week, most weeks anyway. And you would think that this would be a higher scoring game as well. And this would be a bounce back opportunity for the Raider passing game.
And finally, for this one, if Zach Moss were to return, because he's been limited on Wednesday and Thursday, would that move the needle for you at all as for Jonathan Taylor's presence, or still all in on him?
It would. I mean, I'd have him ranked probably as an RB1. I've got him at RB5 right now. The Vegas is 25th adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. But if Moss is back, then that would probably eat into his ceiling, because he probably wouldn't see every single touch or 95% of the touches like he will see if he doesn't have Moss, a capable backup like Moss. So, that would ding him a bit. Probably move him down a few spots. But these guys in the, Jahmyr Gibbs is a part-timer. Saquon Barkley is a bell cow. James Cook is pretty much a bell cow. DeAndre Swift is kind of a bell cow, but doesn't get rushing touchdowns very often. So there are some question marks with those guys in terms of their floors and their ceilings. So I think Taylor would still be a really good start with Moss back. I definitely would think that Moss wouldn't have like a 50-50 type timeshare with Taylor. It'd probably be more like 80-20.
Falcons at the Bears, and not the same spot at all for this Falcons offense. Had the Colts indoors last week, but now they're traveling to the frigid and wet tundra in Chicago outdoors. The Bears defense, since they added Montez Sweat, also has allowed one running back, David Montgomery, to go over 70 yards. And that was in a game where they were blowing the Lions out and just backed up and let the Lions kill the clock on the ground. So I know people see Tyler Algier, double-digit carries last 2 games. It's not the spot to get him in. You definitely want to look elsewhere for help. But how are you ranking just the pieces in general for this Falcons offense?
I think the only player that, you really really to start, and even you feel a little bit dicey about, is Bijan Robinson, because, he's probably going to get his 18 to 22 touches if Arthur Smith doesn't have another brain fart, I guess.
Right.
So, I don't really want to start Drake London in this matchup. I don't really want to start Kyle Pitts in this matchup. The Bears defense has been really good. So I'm only starting those players if I absolutely have to, and I don't have, any other options on the bench, because, they're talented players, but this is just a bad matchup pretty much from top to bottom.
And if DJ Moore were to go, I'm assuming you have him ranked as a fringe wide receiver 1, if not lower. We're still waiting on his injury, though, is the thing.
Yeah, I have him ranked lower than that because of the injury. Like, he didn't look like himself after that ankle injury.
I was shocked he returned.
Yeah, I was as well, and I think he's dicey to play, and there's some downside. So Atlanta's a pretty tough, against the pass as well. They're 11th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers. So I've got him ranked as a low end wide receiver 2. I think I'd like to start like DeAndre Hopkins over him, for example, with Will Levis likely back. But if he's full tomorrow, or it looks like it wasn't a high ankle sprain or anything like that. It was just a 1 week deal where he, was kind of gimpy in game, and he's a lot better heading into this week, then he'll move up. But I don't, when these guys are trying to play through injuries, it really slides them down about 5 to 10 spots in my rankings, because you just kind of lose that confidence in them. And then there's always the downside that they have an in-game setback and aren't able to finish a game.
And if I had to choose one running back for the Bears, hopefully no one's in a position to, I think it would be back to D'Onta Foreman, since I believe we're going to get positive game script for the Bears in this one. And if that's the case, at least they've shown us in the past, they prefer to lean on Foreman. But again, I played Roshan because of that past evidence last week. And it turns out they played him against the Vikings before the bye over Herbert, if only to keep him in to pass block against Brian Flores' blitz defense. So if it were not Foreman and it were Herbert instead, at this point, nothing would shock me, which is why I'm trying to stay away.
Yeah, let me just put it this way. I don't have any Bears running back in my top 35 running backs. But Herbert is my top one at 36, Foreman at 38, and then, Roshan Johnson at 47. I do sort of think that maybe Herbert won the RB1 job back, and I don't know what's going on with Foreman and his personal issue that kept him away from practice, and they decided to rule him out last week. So just to me, there's maybe a little bit of smoke there that maybe Herbert is back in the fold as the RB1, and he did well last week. So maybe he's earned some more snaps and perhaps the start.
The Panthers at the Jaguars, and as you can personally attest, Joe Barry's defense brought Bryce Young back to life with a 300-yard performance. The thing is, for the Jaguars offense, not only is Trevor Lawrence banged up with his third different injury this year, but the argument against Jordan Love in the passing game last week is the same thing. It was that the Panthers defense has been genuinely incredible. The secondary has been dictating games out of their bye since week 8 now. They're allowing just 5.9 yards per attempt through the air. No quarterback has gone over 230 yards in that span. So again, whether it's Lawrence or Beathard, I do think it's a pretty bad spot for Jacksonville's offense overall.
Yeah, I'm looking for other options than Calvin Ridley. Certainly if Lawrence is able to play, I'd feel better about starting Ingram, Ridley. But if it's Beathard, then I'm just like, oh man, it's dicey.
Beathard has consistently dumped it off to Evan Ingram, so that's where my confidence would go. But yeah, with Calvin Ridley, we just lose the juice. Yeah,
the only thing you have going for you right now with this receiving core is that it's very concentrated because of the injury to Christian Kirk, and I don't think Zay Jones is back yet. So it's just Ridley and basically Ingram. So there is that, but it's one of the worst matchups in the league for passing games. As you mentioned, the Panthers have been really good. They're also really bad against the run, or have been pretty bad against the run. So this is probably going to shape up as a Travis Etienne game. And I would think that if it's Beathard, they would really try to go run heavy and kind of take the game out of his hands and let Etienne try to win it.
We also saw, as we expected, Baker Mayfield, Mike Evans have big games last week against this Jags secondary that has struggled immensely since they've come out of their bye. A lot due to injuries, but really it's just regression as they were overachieving the first half of the season. So you probably don't need to get there, but honestly, if you need players, I think Adam Thielen and DJ Chark in like 14, 16 team leagues are fine in this matchup, just how bad the Jaguars have been.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I wouldn't want to start Bryce Young either, but maybe in a super flex, he's viable given that he had a good game last week in a similarly happy matchup against the Packers defense. Thielen, I have at 34, just as a PPR type guy, and Chark at 53. You don't have a lot of confidence in either player, but it is a good matchup.
Saints and Bucks, I think will be a fun one, because of just how poor both defenses have been playing. Let's start on the Saints side of the ball, because not only has Derek Carr now been a top 9 quarterback in back-to-back games, this is the best matchup possible for him against this Bucks defense that we continue playing everyone against. Even Beathard and Lawrence, who was injured mid-game, combined for 18 fantasy points. And now here's Carr, not only getting Rashid Shaheed involved, but Chris Olave has a 25% target share against the blitz this season, and Todd Bowles is blitzing the Bucs defense, the league's 3rd highest rate. So I do like the options through the air here between Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed.
So how high would you say you are on Carr?
I would start. I've had to think about it because I did the rankings for the waiver wire, then I backed off. Nick Mullins, who was benched, was at the top, but we'll get to Jaren Hall because I think I would start Jaren Hall over Joe Flacco for the rushing upside, honestly. I would start Derek Carr over Joe Flacco. If someone has that question tonight, I have a lot of confidence in this game's environment and both offenses.
I would agree with that. I have Carr at 17, Flacco at 18.
Yeah,
You did mention
nitpicking,
that Carr, he had 20.3 against the Giants, 25.0 against the Rams in the last 2 weeks. But prior to that, he had 4 games, 11 points or less. So it's like you could look at the last 2 weeks and say, oh, he's back to being great or good Derek Carr.
Yeah.
But it wasn't that long ago that we were talking about benching him, but it might have been injury related. He did have some, had some 49%, 62% snap rates. As you mentioned, though, this is a great matchup, and he has 6 touchdowns in his last 2 games, and Olave back and Shaheed. So it is a pretty good environment to stream him.
And condensed target tree between those two. So that's also why I like it quite a bit. For the Bucks, I keep saying, as I mentioned last week, that eventually Chris Godwin has to get here. Since he's still lingering around with a higher target share over their last 3 games together than Evans. The issue is that Evans is the one who is inevitable. He is the one who keeps scoring touchdowns, and no Marshawn Lattimore, since historically that's what happens in these matchups, is that they allow Lattimore to shadow Evans, and Evans has been for his entire career so bad against one-on-one coverage that he fails in those spots. But with so many injuries now for this Saints defense, you can just play everyone.
Yeah, for sure with Evans. I mean, he's been a top 10 ranked receiver all year, basically.
He's been awesome.
So many touchdowns. And I'm just looking at Chris Godwin's game log, and I love Chris Godwin. I've loved him for a long time in fantasy. I just, these guys that rack up these catches like this are so much fun to play in PPR formats. And he's got 11, 12, and 11 targets in the last 3 weeks, 5 for 53, 10 for 155 against my Packers, poorest defense, and 6 for 78 against the Jaguars. He has 1 touchdown on 74 catches.
It's unreal.
Which is kind of mind-boggling. It's like Deontay Johnson level mind-bogglingness. 119 targets with 1 touchdown. He does have a rushing touchdown as well, which that's hilarious, right?
Everything we said about Deontay Johnson this offseason, we are literally just going to
say
copy
next
and paste,
year.
And just put Godwin stats in there instead.
For sure.
For the Bucks, or for the Bucks as well, yes, you know exactly what to do with the backfield here. Even like Rachaad White last week, averaging less than 3 yards per carry, it just doesn't matter whenever you're also consistently getting the passing involvement. So again, Baker Mayfield, Rachaad White, K. Dotton, if you need to get there, they're all perfectly fine. You want to play everyone in this game. And a similar matchup is the Cardinals and Eagles, because the Eagles are touting this 29.5 point team total. And it's just a Cardinals defense that doesn't blitz, plays soft zone coverage, and pretty much allows you to do whatever you want. It sucks for DAndre Swift because he's like a child running in from outside that can't see the glass door that was just cleaned. And so every time he reaches the goal line, he smacks into this door and falls down. I've never seen a worse runner trying to cross the goal line. It's as if he purposely wants to fall down in that spot. And that's why from the 2-yard line in, Jalen Hurts has outcarried him 14-1 because the tush push is undefeated. So although it's an incredible matchup micro-wise for DAndre Swift, he still needs the touchdown to get there. He
does. And, you think he probably will get a lot of carries in this one in positive game script. Mm-hmm. Maybe he gets his touch. He's got 5 rushing touchdowns. He's only got 2 in the last 6 weeks. And then the other issue with him that's kind of hurting his floor is the lack of receiving. He has 2 catches in the last 3 weeks for 1 yard. He hasn't gone over 10 yards receiving since week 11. So that really doesn't, give you the ceiling that we want out of our RB1s, right? But this is a good spot with Arizona because he probably will see 18 to 20 carries, and he could rush for over 100 yards and, get in the end zone once. Maybe he gets so excited when he gets inside the 5 because he thinks he might actually score that he just kind of loses his composure and runs into a defender or trips or something because he feels like he's finally going to get a touchdown, and then he ends up handing it over to Hurts.
The running back on the other side is someone who I'm also excited about because what's happened is that they do have the personnel, Philadelphia, and the talent to be a good defense, but their injuries, their missed coverages have been so porous this year. They played more defensive backs than any other defense in the NFL. And now we're also seeing their running game leak immensely. Saquon Barkley got there last week with 80 yards and a touchdown. Ken Walker before that with 86 and a touchdown. So with James Conner now on this hellacious streak, RB12 and 3 or top 12 running back in 3 consecutive games, I do think it's a really good spot, like under the table for James Conner.
Yeah, it'd be flying a little bit under the radar because you look at the numbers. The Eagles are 6th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs, but as you mentioned, they've been giving up since week 13, giving up 101 rushing yards on average and 1 touchdown to opposing backfields, plus 29 yards receiving. We know that they've been a pass funnel this year, but it looks like they are becoming a equally bad run defense as well. 4.2 yards per carry is not terrible against running backs, but as I mentioned, 101 rushing yards per game to opposing running backs, pretty significant. So 130 total yards, and that James Conner is going to get a lot of that. How do you feel about Kyler Murray this week?
A little bit worried just because the most points he scored all year is 22, I believe, 22, 24, depending on what scoring format you look at. He's just lacked the ceiling. And so although it is still a secondary we do want to target, they've had easier matchups these past 2 games. So it's masked how poor and how great of a matchup they've been for fantasy. Kyler Murray, to me, just can't be anything more than a low-end QB1 because he hasn't shown he can be.
Yeah, that's where I have him ranked at low-end QB1. I was just curious because the matchup, 26th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, and he's coming off of 3 tough matchups. The Pittsburgh was 4th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. San Francisco was 7th, and Chicago was 9th. So he only scored 20.4, which was actually not bad. 11.8 against Pittsburgh, 13.3 against San Francisco, and then 20.4 last week against Chicago, which is not bad given that matchup. But I think he should be a little bit better, and he does have like top 5, top 6 upside. But he's got a. I mean, I think what you're kind of counting on is Philly jumping out to a lead, and the Cardinals having to go pretty pass heavy for most of the second half.
Eagles also last or first, however you want to say it, in receiving yards per game allowed to opposing slot receivers, but it's actually Trey McBride who's ran 68% of his routes from the slot. So a game we have confidence in him. And then honestly, even without Marquise Brown, just no one is instilling enough confidence to play them. I want to play Greg Dortch. I think it's a good matchup, but Dortch isn't being used in the slot this year, whereas under Cliff Kingsbury he was, and he's still running routes behind both Rondale Moore and Michael Wilson, who's laid eggs in back-to-back games. So I don't have confidence in Dortch, but if I need to, that's probably like as deep as I go in a 14-team league.
Yeah, you mentioned, though, McBride is the must-start out of this receiving group for sure.
49ers at the Commanders, and you can't pick a better bounce back spot for Brock Purdy in this offense. Now Brock Purdy still leading the league in yards per attempt from a clean pocket, and since Commanders traded both Chase Young and Montez Sweat, they're the only defense creating pressure on less than 30% of opposing quarterbacks' dropbacks. So Purdy, George Kittle, Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, you can't pick their number of targets because they're all going to just get there on uber efficiency. But the point is they're all going to get there here.
Yeah, and I would say with Purdy, he had the stinger, was unable to finish the game. It looks like he is going to play. I see him doing some press, and usually injured players or people that are in danger of not playing don't give press time. So it looks like he's probably in line to play. But if he has a setback or is unable to play, I think Sam Darnold's a really good streamer, in a fantastic matchup. And, Sam Darnold has kind of turned his career around, and I think he's in the best spot possible playing for Kyle Shanahan if he ever gets a chance to start, because he'll probably deliver in this offense.
On the other side of the ball, what's interesting with Jacoby Brissett being named starter, I do think he gives a little bit of life to the Commanders offense. He's now been brought off the bench in back-to-back games, and on all 5 possessions he's been inserted for, they've ended with a touchdown. Terry McLaurin also a 22.5% target share, team high mark for Brissett these last 2 weeks as well. And the boundary is where you attack the 49ers. That's their weakest personnel. That's where allowing the second most catches per game to opposing receivers from out wide. So I like McLaurin again with Brissett under center.
Brissett probably should be every week starter in this league. Just lacks the like franchise. He's our franchise quarterback type upside or guy to build around, because he's good enough to be in this 15 to 30 range in this league, because just given his resume of playing time and how he's done. But filling in for Sam Howell now. He's targeted Terry McLaurin on 5 of his 23 pass attempts this year, 21.7 target share. He's completed 4 of those 5 targets for 122 yards. I don't think he'll be able to keep this up, but that's 24.4 yards per target to Terry McLaurin. There is a bit of life here, I think, with Terry McLaurin. I've got him ranked as a low-end wide receiver 2 with Brissett at quarterback. And, the outside, as you mentioned, that's where the 49ers are a little bit vulnerable in the passing game.
It's a good week, honestly, for streaming quarterbacks, even in super flex leagues. Like I have all the confidence in the world in grabbing the bundle of Jaron Hall, Tyrod Taylor, Jacoby Brissett, Jarrett Stidham, because they are backup quarterbacks in amazing spots against bad defenses and good environment. So we've seen throughout the year, Jake Browning, everyone else included, like what happens is these backups come in hot, and then give it 2 or 3 games. Opposing coordinators get the film on them, and they shut them down because they're backups. They can't progress more than that. But honestly, their first couple of starts, we've seen them give life. And that makes me want to also say that not only do I have confidence starting Jacoby Brissett where I need to, but also Tyrod Taylor and the Giants hosting the Rams. Because in 3 games that where he started a majority of the snaps, not only is Taylor providing 6 carries per game in those contests, but he came off the bench again last week. It's what we saw against Buffalo on Sunday night in one of his last starts, and just provided a ceiling. Just started popping it for over 8 yards per attempt, went over 100 yards to a touchdown. So against this Rams defense that is this last month, they're struggling to create pressure as these younger players are now dwindling towards the end of the year. I do think it's a pretty good spot, honestly, for both offenses here to give us a ceiling.
The Rams defense has become a bit of a pass funnel. They're 28th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. They're 3rd in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. I think Saquon Barkley is fine, but it might just create some opportunities for Tyrod Taylor having to throw the ball, more play calls, pass play calls, as opposed to runs if they have trouble running with Barkley. That's just how it's sort of trend over the last few weeks, being 28th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. So Tyrod Taylor has always been a good fantasy asset because of the ability to run, and he's a competent thrower. And they do have, most of their weapons pretty healthy. So that is a decent spot. And you're also, looking at a Rams defense or offense that's pretty hot. So this could be a higher scoring game than people think. And
you don't need to tell anyone, but obviously you just start everyone for the Rams as well. Puka Nacua seeing a team high 25.5% target share against the blitz this year, and Wink Martindale's blitzing at the 2nd highest rate. Cooper Kupp seems to be back to full strength now, in these last 3 games has looked great. Kyren Williams is just handling every single touch, even in blowout game scripts. So again, for everyone involved with Tyrod under center, it got me really excited about the environment here, because I think both offenses are going to have a lot of success.
I would also mention Demarcus Robinson, who's been hot as well as the 3rd receiver. I've got him ranked at 42, given the Giants are 21st in just the fantasy points allowed to receivers. So he's that tertiary option that's been really effective lately.
Tutu Atwell returned from concussion, but for everyone listening, it was still Robinson who ran around on 94% of dropbacks and 3 wide sets. The touchdowns, as he's scored now in 6 consecutive games, are not sustainable, but at the same time, yes, he is involved in this potent offense and a very good matchup. So you can continue starting Demarcus Robinson in 12-team leagues as well. The Patriots and the Bills in Buffalo, it's actually been fairly predictable for Gabe Davis against man and zone splits. And so I will say, although I was confident in Davis last week, I'm backing up. Where you need to play him, I understand. It's no big deal. He's Gabe Davis. He can still go off at any time. But the Patriots are one of only 2 defenses playing man defense on over 40% of their snaps. And that's exactly what Davis has struggled against, not only this season, but for his entire career. So Diggs, who didn't get there in the box score, but literally led every receiver in the NFL in target share last week, Diggs is the player I finally can say I believe his ceiling will come in this game.
Okay.
Because it's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while, and so he's been kind of slipping down our rankings. Obviously, to start the year, he's a top 6 or 7 every week type player, and he's at 13 this week. So I've got him ranked below Ayuk and Rashee Rice and Puka Nacua and Nico Collins right now, just based on his recent performance. But your splits with Gabe Davis are interesting. Davis, I have it at 38, and I wouldn't want to start him because he's just like, I'm never going to draft him again unless it's best ball. I'm not doing it anymore. I'm going to pass on him no matter what, every redraft league, because he goes from 0 to 100, and you just don't know exactly. You say it's predictable. I don't know. I try to predict it, and it just doesn't seem to work out. Every time I get those man zone splits, I bump him up the rankings, and then he doesn't deliver. So, and I don't know how much of a high scoring game this is going to be too. This is the Patriots are just kind of a crappy offense. I don't know if the Bills are going to have to throw a whole lot in order to stay in this one. So Gabe Davis makes me nervous, but I think Stephon Diggs certainly is a pretty much an every week start, unless you're really, really loaded at receiver. And the Patriots are 24th adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers.
And for the Patriots, I would think that Demario Douglas is probably the only one people can play, depending if we get Hunter Henry back this game, because Douglas at least has a floor. He's not going to give you a ceiling at all. He's a possession receiver, but he does get the catches from Zack.
Yeah, and I would agree that Hunter Henry is viable as a streamer if he's healthy enough to play. The Bills are 25th in adjusted fantasy points, a lot of tight ends, and he had 2 really good games with Bailey Zappi prior to that knee injury.
Titans and the Texans. And it sounds like CJ Stroud will be back from his 2-week absence of the concussion protocol. My only concern, although it is an incredible matchup, so it probably doesn't matter. And again, the top 12 quarterbacks are just thinned out to the point where you probably are starting Stroud. The only thing is, at least we've seen from Trevor Lawrence, Brock Purdy, those who returned from concussion protocol did struggle in their first game back. So that would be my only issue here with Stroud in this matchup. Otherwise, it's one we continue to target against this Titans pass funnel.
Yeah, we saw some, I quoted some other numbers coming off of the concussion for receivers. They also, their fantasy production coming off that concussion is 30% lower than normal. I need to look at the quarterback numbers as well. I have to start Stroud this week. I don't really have a choice in one of my toilet bowl finals. But I feel pretty confident with him, although, you are a bit worried about any player coming off of a concussion. The processing, just brain injuries in general are scary. But the matchup's good. Tennessee is 20th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. It really does bump up Nico Collins with Stroud back under center. And it does make Noah Brown an interesting streaming wide receiver 3 flex type with Tank Dell out. So I think it's going to be pretty concentrated between Nico Collins, Noah Brown, and probably Dalton Schultz at tight end.
The same can be said for the Texans backfield, because we are getting Devin Singletary now the last 2 weeks, significantly over Dameon Pierce. And honestly, although the Titans did start out as a team you couldn't run on, we've seen the past couple of games that they just lost so many players now that they are leaking a bit of running production. So since we can have confidence all of a sudden and Devin Singletary getting the touches, I definitely think he's a good start yet again this week.
I would agree with that. I mean, that was a tough backfield to sort of gauge for a span there, because they randomly gave Dameon Pierce the lead back role in the middle of all this, but it's been back to still Devin Singletary as the primary back, and it's a pretty good matchup. Tennessee's 20th in just fantasy points allowed to running backs.
Dolphins and the Ravens, and it sounds as if Jaylen Waddle is not going to play. And if that's the case, although it is a very tough matchup, I will say Tyreek Hill has been targeted on 45.5% of his routes with Waddle off the field this year. Not that anyone's going to bench Tyreek Hill anyhow, but he's a player I definitely have confidence in. How are you ranking the backfield, however, with Raheem Mostert battling an ankle injury?
The Ravens are first in the league in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running back. So it's tough to rank Mostert in the top 10 and also have Achane in the top 25 or so. So the way it works out here, he's at 15, Mostert is. We'll see where his ankle injury is. I do feel like if Waddle is out, they may try to go run heavy in this game because of just the lack of weapons around Tua. But whether or not they're going to have success at that, I don't know. The Ravens on a per carry basis actually aren't that great, but I think teams just can't keep up the running against them. They've only given up 5 rushing touchdowns this year. They're giving up 4.4 yards per carry, 103 rushing yards, but they're one of the lowest in terms of number of rushes against. 4th lowest runs against them at 351, probably because they are leading most of the time. But if the Dolphins want to stick with it and keep this game close, it might be a normal game for Mostert and Achane where they're getting their 60 to 70 yards rushing and maybe a touchdown to boot.
I worry about the total in this game at all because it's 2 great defenses. I know everyone tried to say last week it's the schedule why the Dolphins have been good since Jalen Ramsey have come back. But as I always argued back, the pieces are there under Vic Fangio who can scheme it up with Jalen Ramsey as a chess piece. So it makes sense that they did shut the Cowboys offense down. And so I just worry about both offenses in this game overall. It also doesn't sound like Zay Flowers is close to playing, which is I'm really worried about. Would there be any fallout if Flowers are ruled out for you?
I just wanted to mention that Ravens yards per play allowed, 2nd fewest, 4.5. Dolphins, 5th fewest yards per play, 4.8, to underscore your point that both defenses are really good. If Flowers is out, then I think Lamar Jackson's still Lamar Jackson. I mean, Rashad Bateman, Nelson Aguilar, Odell Beckham can pick up the slack. Isaiah Likely's been pretty good. And then, Jackson
really good.
Jackson gets most of his fantasy or a lot of his fantasy points running the ball anyway. It certainly would be, a little dicey to start any of those guys because you just don't know which one is going to pop his head up for a touchdown or 2. Obviously, you're starting Likely probably if he's at tight end 6 for me this week. But if I were to remove Flowers from the rankings today, Beckham probably be the guy I would want to start. And then, I don't think I would have a lot of confidence in Bateman or Aguilar. I just don't think it hurts Lamar Jackson a whole lot because he does have those 2 guys to kind of fall back on.
You also have the rushing floor for Lamar Jackson. So even if Flowers is out because he hasn't practiced through Thursday and the calf injury sounds like it's dwindling, at least we know Lamar can still get there on his own without him. Steelers and Seahawks. Mason Rudolph gets by the Bengals, who only exist in the NFL to correct bad offenses. Every single week, it seems like, did they play the Bengals or not? Because that dictates running games and how offenses fare. But this one, with the Seahawks banged up, what do you think about Geno Smith in the passing game? I threw you for a loop there. Sorry, I lost my concentration. I didn't mean to set you up for the Steelers offense.
Geno, I have it a QB 15, and he's like one of those guys. We were talking about Derek Carr, and I was like, well, I'm looking at him in my rankings, and he's got this great matchup, but he's below 3 players that have had more scoring upside at quarterback, but have a bad matchup. Jordan Love, who's fantasy QB 6 on the year at Minnesota, 3rd against quarterbacks. Geno Smith at home, Pittsburgh, 4th against quarterbacks, and then Tua at Baltimore, 6th best against quarterbacks in terms of limiting their fantasy points. So he's in this group where it's like, he's startable, but you feel a little bit dicey about it. But Pittsburgh's defense has been sort of up and down. And, Smith has a good receiving core. He did deliver last week. So I feel decent about him, but there, definitely some other guys that you could turn to if you didn't feel so great about him.
For the Steelers now, to go back there, how are you handling the receivers from Mason Rudolph? Because we did see still a lot of unsustainable production. George Pickens with a couple Hall of Fame catches, also turning basically a screen 86 yards upfield after broken tackles. And so I think what the Steelers did can be a little misleading.
So George Pickens is one of these guys that maybe, doesn't have the reputation of being the greatest route runner, but if the quarterback trusts him to the point where he'll throw him the ball, he's good in the contested catch. So a lot of what George Pickens can do in his ceiling is whether or not the quarterback is willing to throw to a covered receiver. So I think when a player is coming off of a game like this, 195 yards, 2 touchdowns, 35.5 fantasy points with a new quarterback, I do tend to bump them up a bit because it does seem like there is a nice rapport there between the two and at least some trust. So he is ranked a bit ahead of Deontay Johnson this week for that reason. Just sort of leaning on the hot hand at this point. And he wasn't like he was terrible before this. He didn't have a touchdown since week 8, but he did have an 86-yard game, a 58-yard game since week 12 and week 13, 47 yards back in week 15. He hasn't been awful. So this is not totally out of the blue. And he did have 3 100-yard games earlier in the year. So, going back to him here doesn't feel like too much of a reach.
Anything else to discuss in their backfield? Because I think by now people are probably just tired of Jaylen Warren's usage and just ultimately not getting there unless he scores a touchdown.
Yeah, you have to hope for I guess you have to hope for a fumble out of Najee to get like consistent usage out of Jaylen Warren. He did play last 2 weeks. He's played 63% of the snaps compared to 39% of the snaps for Najee, but it doesn't matter. Najee's out-touched him, or at least out-carried him 31-18 and out-touched him 31-28. Najee's not involved in the passing game at all. Last 2 weeks, 0 targets. So this is a good matchup against Seattle, though. So I think I could see starting both players if you had to in the flex.
Bengals at Chiefs, and I know it's been a struggle for Patrick Mahomes all year, but again, here comes the Bengals defense that even the last 2 weeks, Nick Mullins, who was benched, and Mason Rudolph last week got there against. And so it is arguably Mahomes' easiest matchup all year long. We have still the breakout happening for Rashee Rice. And so to me, it seems like finally a spot where Mahomes can reach his ceiling.
Yeah, I definitely want to play some Mahomes stacks this week against Seattle, against the Cincinnati, including Kelsey and Rashee Rice. Justin Watson might still be cheap again. He's the third option, I think, in the passing game, I would say right now, given all the injuries that they have at receiver. And I think Clyde Edwards-Helaire is a must play if he's able to get over this illness. I know he missed practice today with the illness. Jerick McKinnon's on IR. Pacheco has a shoulder injury and he's in concussion protocol, so it looks unlikely that he's going to play. So if he sits, it could be an every down role for Edwards-Helaire. I've got him ranked at RB18, giving up a few touches to, was it LaMichael Pirine as his background? I got that right. As his backup,
or is it going to be Deneric Prince?
Oh yeah, they have a young guy off the practice squad.
Even though it's a couple touches, I don't think anyone matters, honestly. Even with McKinnon, those last 2 games without Pacheco, it was Helaire handling 65% of backfield touches. Yeah,
I don't want to rank Edwards-Helaire in the top 10, but I think that he certainly has that ceiling, because if he gets every single touch in this offense against the Bengals, he's probably going to finish in the top 10 or 12.
Any other matchup, I agree with you. I would think, you've been so bad all year, even though there's other games. He was really bad. He just caught a 68-yard screen. But again, the Bengals have made every running back look like a Hall of Famer this year.
Yeah, and so if he sees the sort of workload that he should with McKinnon and Pacheco out and gets 90%, 95% of the touches, then he does have that sort of upside.
Every touch CEH is going to be something to tilt for sure on championship week. On the other side of the ball, from Jake Browning, Jamar Chase practiced as of Thursday. So how are you handling Chase in your rankings if he returns?
You said Chase actually practiced today?
Limited, I believe. Yes.
Okay. The last I've seen is that he's out. So if he's out, you're looking at T. Higgins as the number 1. He's probably has L'Jarius Sneed, but L'Jarius Sneed has an injury as well. Higgins has been awesome in the last 2 weeks, but if Chase is back, then obviously Higgins gets bumped down a few slots, and he's more in the high end wide receiver 3, low end wide receiver 2 type rankings. With Chase, probably sliding in as a low end, I guess high end wide receiver 2. I mean, we still have Jake Browning at quarterback, so it's not Joe Burrow. So there are some it'd be an interesting ranking between him and Stephon Diggs. If Jamar Chase is back, because it's 2 really talented players, but just aren't playing, or one has a quarterback issue, one just not producing as well as he has. In
7
years
career
past.
games for T. Higgins as well without Jamar Chase now, and he's averaging just under 100 yards. So I'm still piling on T. Higgins. The matchup is terrible, but you just take it for the volume if Chase is out. I definitely worry about Higgins from Jake Browning in this game if Chase goes. I also know, I think some people will start getting the idea to play Andre Yoshivas since he did tie Higgins with a 19% target share. But again, it's such a bad matchup that championship week is not the time to be digging for Yoshivas.
It's getting awfully cute.
Off the waiver wire. I wrote about 10 receivers and didn't touch him in the waiver wire column. Chargers at the Broncos with Russell Wilson benched. And again, I talked about a little bit about him earlier. Stidham's start against the 49ers last year lives rent-free in my head because it was literally one of the best performances from any quarterback all year long, and I don't know how. He looked amazing in that game against San Francisco, took him to overtime. And honestly, if you didn't watch the game, anyone at home, one, I understand, since it was a Saturday night before Christmas Eve. But also, the Chargers hung around, only lost by 2 points. The Bills' offense still moved the ball at these. 6.5 yards per play. Josh Allen went over 11 yards per attempt. So now it's Stidham under center. I do think the Broncos can put up points and elevate this game environment overall.
The only problem is it looks like Courtland Sutton's going to miss. It'd be so much nicer for Stidham if he had his wide receiver one. But this is a spot where Jerry Jeudy could be flexed in if Sutton misses. It's just a few extra targets going his way could really help. And the Chargers are 27th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers. They're 25th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. So I think Stidham is a viable super flex streamer in this matchup. And even Marvin Mims, who had a pretty good game last week, is creeping up my rankings now. He's ranked as a wide receiver 5 after being a wide receiver 6 or below for most of the year.
On the other side of the ball, although Gift Smith and Kellen Moore did some intuitive things on offense, we saw Austin Eckler in motion for the most in any game all year. Easton Stick got purposeful carries since he was a rushing quarterback in college, but then under Brandon Staley, they didn't use him to run at all whenever the team quit on Staley. But the issue is that I am pretty sure Keenan Allen has played his last snap with the Chargers already. Not only that, it doesn't look like Josh Palmer is going to play this game either with a concussion. So if that's the case, and it's only Easton Stick and Quentin Johnson against the Broncos secondary, I'm not really interested anymore.
I'm only interested in playing Austin Eckler because it's a nice matchup against the Broncos running game. They would be a rush defense. They would be wise to go pretty run heavy given their lack of receivers. I think Gerald Everett is streamable at tight end.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about Everett.
A low end tight end 1. Quentin Johnson, I have at 44. I'm pretty sure that's as high as I've ranked him this year. And it's just because there's nobody else to throw to. I mean, it's ugly even after him. At least he's has the draft capital and has played. So he's at 44. He's kind of in that Jerry Jeudy, Demarcus Robinson, Tyler Boyd, KJ Osborne range. So I don't have any confidence in that. I could easily see him having a goose egg. So really the only confident players for me are Eckler pretty much because he did bounce back with a pretty nice game last week, and Gerald Everett at tight end.
Everett, I forgot to emphasize how good of a play he is this week. 25% target share in back-to-back games. The Broncos just getting gassed for the most points per game to opposing tight ends. So I agree. Everett as safe as it comes, honestly, in terms of streaming tight ends. And finally, Sunday Night Football, Packers and the Vikings. Nick Mullins benched, which is, yes, he deserved to be benched, but still he went over 400 yards and they still said, brother, like we saw those interceptions and it was awful. The thing is that Jared Hall has 4 carries on 14 dropbacks this year. He was a rushing quarterback at BYU as well. And so against this Joe Barry defense, I think he offers both a high floor and ceiling higher than perceived.
Absolutely. And I bet you haven't checked my rankings since I put Jaron Hall in the rankings today. He is my QB 10 right now. And I feel like that's way too high.
You hate Joe Barry more than anyone else.
My rookie quarterback model has Hall for 20 yards rushing per game, which I think is a bit conservative against this Packer defense, they have given up the 4th most rushing yards to opposing quarterbacks this year. Watching them as a fan, they always like forget that running quarterbacks can run. So I think he's going to be more like 25, 30 yards rushing, floor for him. So that puts him in that, upper end QB2 mix. Now the Packers are also pretty bad against the pass. They suspended Jair Alexander for going out and going to the coin toss when he shouldn't have.
Yep.
So I probably would still, I'm looking at this ranking and but kind of fiddling with it. I probably still would start Matthew Stafford, but I think Jaron Hall, Jared Goff is a very interesting question given that Dallas is pretty good on defense. Kyler Murray. I think Jaron Hall is just in a prime matchup. He's got Justin Jefferson at least. I know they're down TJ Hawkinson and Jordan Addison, but Osborne's been pretty good. They've got Josh Oliver at tight end as well, who is pretty athletic. And I know that they have another dude Johnny Munt, who actually ran more routes than Josh Oliver when TJ Hawkinson went out. But I think there's enough there. And Ty Chandler, of course, out of the backfield can catch the ball. So I do think that Jaron Hall is my number one streamer outside of maybe Baker Mayfield this week, just looking at these rankings because of the matchup that he has and his ability to run the ball.
It is Ty Chandler in a much better spot as well compared to last week, again, against a very stout Lions run defense. So I have all the faith in the world going right back to Ty Chandler personally as a fringe RB1 in this matchup. On the other side of the ball, we're waiting on the receivers because it could be an entirely different game if we miss Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, and Dontavian Wicks. Right now, at least, Reed returned to practice. We're waiting on the other two to come back at some point, hopefully by Friday. So what are your thoughts on Jordan Love and the passing attack?
Well, I'm just assuming that Christian Watson's out until he starts practicing. He hasn't practiced as of today. I did see that Dontavian Wicks was out at practice, but they are saying that he's not practicing. That's the official designation, I believe. But it does look like Jaden Reed will be back. So that sort of replaces Wicks in the offense. And they were, Jordan Love was decent last week in a bad matchup against the Panthers. He scored 33 points. He had, a couple touchdowns again. So this is a tough spot against the Vikings. I am also wondering, I DM'd my friend Pat Fitzmaurice, who's also a Packer fan, and I asked if Jordan Love might have a primetime problem.
Did he tell you it's week 17, go away?
No, he was like, oh, no, you gave me a very thoughtful answer because whenever I ask him questions, he gives me
also because he's one of the nicest people ever.
Yes, absolutely. Jordan Love was terrible against the Raiders, terrible against the Giants. He did have the good primetime game against KC. This is another big data point on the road against a defense that's playing really well. And he's shorthanded at receiver. So, I've got him ranked at our quarterback 14. It would be smart to really feature Aaron Jones because Aaron Jones looks real good. And if Jaden Reed's back, that would be good to feature him as well.
With that, Paulson, I think we touched on everything we could for week 17 while we are still waiting on all the shifting news that usually happens this time of year. What else do you have for everyone coming out on the site before they lock in their lineups?
This is it. The final sneaky start of the year is up on the site. I'm going to continue to update it because we do have a lot of moving pieces with people that may not play. I've already added a couple of players since I published it. So keep an eye on that if you're wondering about my take on a certain player that is all of a sudden thrust into a starting role, because that tends to happen this time of year. And just stay on top of the rankings. But it's been a pleasure co-hosting with this with you. You're a fantastic podcast host. You keep things moving along. Even though you got me thinking about the Steelers earlier, and then threw me a Geno Smith question. That was maybe your only hiccup all year, John. So great job.
It's week 17. I'm allowed to make all the mistakes in the world, as the bags under my eyes are just so large at this point. I will also be back one more time with TJ Hernandez, Pat Kyren for the DFS show tomorrow, 6 p.m. Eastern. We actually got 13 games on the slate, so feels like old school DFS in that good players are going to go overlooked across the board. We'll even talk about, as you mentioned, Paulson, a little bit of a Washington stack, maybe some Marvin Mims. We'll get to all those players tomorrow. So until that point, at least for Thursday, whether I'm here or not, remember, be a little bit kinder than what's required. We'll see you next time.